The widow's front door shook under a single knock so heavy it made the hanging kettle ring like a bell. Outside, the port of Caldera held its breath in the fog. But inside, Maris Crow was about to face a storm wearing a man's coat. Captain Magnus Slate, the giant, stood on her threshold with a terrified girl and a vow that would shatter the peace of the low docks. By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you. It was a lie meant to save her life. But as the seasons turn and the danger closes in, the line between the vow and the truth begins to blur. Read the story of the vow that shook the port. The knock was not a request, it was an impact. The heavy iron kettle hanging above the hearth rang like a dull bell, the sound vibrating through the small, flour-dusted kitchen. Maris Crow froze, her hands buried deep in a ceramic bowl of dough. The wind outside was howling, a late autumn gale that rattled the shutters and drove the damp fog of Port Caldera through every crack in the wood. It was a night for thieves and ghosts, not visitors. She wiped her hands on her apron, leaving ghostly white streaks on the rough fabric, and moved toward the door. She didn't reach for a knife. She was a widow in the low docks. Her sharpest weapon was usually her tongue, and she kept it ready. When she threw the bolt and pulled the heavy oak door open, the wind rushed in, carrying the scent of brine, roasted peppers from the street braziers, and the heavy, wet smell of wool. But the wind was blocked by a wall. Captain Magnus Slate filled the doorframe, his presence so sudden and absolute that the street behind him seemed to vanish. The lantern light from the hallway caught the silver buttons of his coat, strained across a chest broad enough to break a mast. His face was a map of hard years, a square jaw shadowed by stubble, eyes the color of deep ocean water, and a scar running into his hairline that suggested he had survived things that killed lesser men. He was looking down at her, not with the leer of a drunken sailor, but with a terrifying, anchored calm. And he was not alone. Behind him, shielded from the wind by the bulk of his body, stood a girl. She couldn't have been more than 18, fragile as a bird, clutching a bundle to her chest. Her eyes were wide, darting between Maris and the shadows of the street. Maris opened her mouth to speak, to demand an explanation, but Magnus spoke first. His voice was a low rumble, a sound that you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. "Widow Crow," he said. He didn't shout, yet the words cut through the wind. "By winter, you'll have my son growing inside you." The world seemed to stop. The kettle ceased its swinging. The wind held its breath. Maris felt the blood drain from her face, then rush back in a hot, violent tide of outrage. She stepped back, her hand instinctively going to her throat. "Excuse me?" Magnus didn't blink. He didn't smile. He looked past her, over her shoulder, into the warmth of her kitchen, and then back to her face. He raised his voice slightly, pitching it not for her, but for the darkness of the alleyway behind him. "I said, by winter, my son will be growing in your belly, and any man who interferes with my house or my woman answers to the giant." Maris saw it then, the slight shift in his stance. The way his hand hovered near the hilt of the cutlass at his hip, not drawing it, just reminding the world it was there. She looked past him. At the far end of the lane, barely visible through the fog, two men in the distinctive blue coats of the Port Authority were pausing. They held clipboards. Inspectors, the vultures who had been circling her kitchen for weeks, looking for a reason to revoke her license, to take the roof over her head. They heard the voice. They saw the silhouette of the giant blocking the widow's door. They turned around and walked away. Maris let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked up at Magnus, her eyes narrowing. The outrage was still there, but now it was mixed with a sharp, cold realization. "Get inside," she hissed. Magnus stepped over the threshold, ducking his head to avoid the lintel. The girl followed, slipping in like a shadow. Maris slammed the door and threw the bolt, shutting out the fog in the eyes of the port. The kitchen, usually cozy, suddenly felt suffocatingly small. Magnus Slate took up too much air. He stood near the hearth, the water dripping from his coat sizzling on the hot iron of the stove. Maris turned on him, her flour-dusted hands clenched into fists. "You have a lot of nerve, Captain. You just told half the district that I'm your whore." "I told them you are under my protection," Magnus corrected, his voice dropping to a rumble again. He began to unbutton his wet coat, his movements slow and deliberate. "There is a difference. Not to the church, not to the market women," Maris snapped. "Reputation is currency here, and you just spent mine." "Your reputation was about to be homeless beggar," Magnus said. He pulled the coat off and draped it over a chair. Underneath, he wore a simple linen shirt that strained at the shoulders. "Those men were coming to seize your property. Unpaid taxes, or just a lack of a bribe?" "A missing seal on a document," Maris said bitterly. "Armand Vell's doing. He wants the land for a warehouse." She stopped, looking at him suspiciously. "How did you know?" Magnus didn't answer immediately. He turned to the girl, who was standing by the pantry, trembling. "Sit, Lena," he said gently. The contrast between his voice now and the thunder he had used outside was jarring. The girl, Lena, sat on a stool, clutching her bundle. She looked at Maris with eyes full of apology and terror. "She needs a place to sleep," Magnus said, meeting Maris's gaze. "A place that doesn't rock with the tide, a place where men don't scream in the night." Maris looked at the girl. She saw the frayed cuffs of her dress, the way she flinched when the fire popped. Maris's heart, which she tried to keep encased in iron, developed a crack. "And the price for her safety is my name?" Maris asked. "The price is a lie," Magnus said. "A vow. In this port, a vow is harder than steel. If I claim you, Vell cannot touch you without starting a war he can't afford. He fears me more than he covets your land." "And what happens when winter comes?" Maris crossed her arms. "And there's no child?" Magnus looked at her, and for a second, he looked tired. "Then we will have bought 3 months of time, and time is the only luxury the poor can afford." Maris stared at him. He was offering a transaction, a lie for a roof, his reputation for her safety. "I have rules," Maris said, her voice steadying. Magnus waited. "1," she said, holding up a finger. "You sleep in the loft. If you come down the stairs at night without an invitation, I will pour boiling oil on you. I don't care how big you are, you'll burn." A ghost of a smile touched Magnus's lips. "Agreed." 2, Maris continued. "Lena helps. I run a business, not a charity. She has hands. She can work." Lena nodded quickly, her eyes wide. "I can work. I know how to clean." 3, Maris said, stepping closer to him, craning her neck to look him in the eye. "You never speak for me again. You spoke the vow to get in the door. Inside this house, you are not the captain, you are a guest." Magnus held her gaze. The air between them was thick, charged with the heat of the stove and the proximity of 2 people who were used to being alone. "Agreed," he said softly. "Then sit," Maris commanded, pointing to the sturdy oak table. "And don't break my chair." The next morning, the fog had lifted, replaced by a crisp, blinding sunlight that bounced off the whitewashed walls of the harbor. Maris woke before dawn, as she always did. For a moment, she forgot. She stretched in her narrow bed, enjoying the silence. Then she heard the heavy, rhythmic creak of floorboards overhead. Memory rushed back, the giant in her loft. She dressed quickly, braiding her dark hair back with efficient, angry movements. When she went down to the kitchen, she expected chaos. Instead, she found silence. Lena was already awake, curled in the corner chair, asleep again with her head on her knees. But the back door was open. Maris walked out into the small courtyard that separated her kitchen from the alley. Magnus was there. He had found her tool chest, a meager collection of rusted iron and worn wood. He was standing on a crate, working on the shutters of the upper window, the ones that had banged all night in the wind. He had stripped off his shirt in the heat of the work. His back was a landscape of muscle and old scars, shifting as he drove a new pin into the hinge. He worked with a strange, quiet grace, his large hands handling the small hammer with precision. He sensed her. He stopped, looking over his shoulder. The hinge was rusted through, he said. It would have fallen in the next storm. Maris stood in her doorway, clutching her shawl. I didn't ask you to fix it. The wind was loud, he said simply. It would have woken Lena. He stepped down from the crate, wiping his hands on a rag. In the daylight, he was even more imposing. The neighbors were already peeking over the low stone walls, whispering. Maris could see the heads bobbing, the fingers pointing. Of the widow and the giant, did you hear what he said? By winter? Maris felt the flush creeping up her neck. Put your shirt on, she said, her voice sharp. You're scaring the chickens. Magnus glanced at the neighbors, then back at her. He didn't look ashamed. He looked like a man checking the perimeter of a fortress. They are talking, he noted. They are always talking, Maris said. Now they just have a new topic. Come inside. I have bread to bake, and if you're going to eat, you're going to haul flour. He followed her in. The dynamic had shifted, subtly. He was useful. Inside, Lena was waking up. She scrambled to her feet when Magnus entered, her eyes darting to him for reassurance. Lena, Maris said, her voice softer than before. Have you ever kneaded dough? Lena shook her head. No, ma'am, I can sew. We don't eat embroidery, Maris said. She pointed to the sack of flour in the corner. It weighed 50 pounds. Magnus, put that on the table. Magnus lifted the sack with one hand, as if it were filled with feathers, and set it down gently. Wash your hands, Maris told the girl. Hot water and soap, twice. As Lena scrubbed her hands at the basin, Magnus leaned against the wall, crossing his arms. He watched Maris measure out the yeast. You are good with her, he murmured. I am busy, Maris corrected. There is a difference. She has had a hard year, Magnus said, his voice dropping so low, Lena couldn't hear over the splashing water. She flinches at loud noises. She doesn't eat enough. Who is she to you? Maris asked, keeping her eyes on the dough. This was the question that had gnawed at her all night. Was she his daughter? His lover? She's the daughter of a man I owed, Magnus said darkly. He died at sea. I promised to keep her from the sharks. The humankind. Maris looked at him. She saw the truth in his face, or at least part of it. He was a man burdened by debts of honor. And you brought her to a widow's house, Maris said. Because you are the only woman in Port Caldera who looks at men like Armand Vell and doesn't blink, Magnus said. Maris paused. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a dangerous spark of pride. She crushed it immediately. Flattery won't get you extra butter on your toast, Captain. 3 days later, the flour ran low. I have to go to the market, Maris announced, wiping the table down. The kitchen was warm, smelling of yeast and rosemary. It had been a strange 3 days. They moved around each other like ships in a narrow channel, careful, signaling their intent. Magnus spent his days fixing things. The roof tiles, the loose leg of the table, the cracked stone in the hearth. He was paying his rent in labor. I will come with you, Magnus said. He was sitting by the window, whittling a piece of driftwood into a small spoon. I don't need a guard dog, Maris said. You need a mule to carry the sacks, he countered. He stood up, pocketing the knife. And you need the visual, the lie. Maris sighed. Fine, but you walk 2 steps behind. I am not a prize you are parading. As you wish. The walk to the market was a gauntlet. Usually, Maris walked with her head down, ignoring the catcalls from the sailors and the sneers from the merchants who thought a woman shouldn't run a business alone. Today, the street fell silent. As they walked, the crowd parted. Eyes went wide. Men who usually sat on crates, smoking and spitting, pulled their legs in and looked at the ground. Magnus walked behind her, silent, massive. He wore his coat, the collar turned up. He didn't glare. He just existed. And that was enough. Maris felt a strange sensation. For the first time in years, she wasn't walking with her shoulders hunched against a blow. She was walking in a bubble of calm. They reached the grain merchant, a man named Silas, who always tried to overcharge her on the weight. Widow Crow, Silas said, his eyes darting nervously to the giant behind her. I have the winter wheat. Good price today. The same price as last week, I hope, Maris said. Better, Silas squeaked. For friends. He weighed the sack. Usually, his thumb rested on the scale. Today, he kept his hands high in the air, showing her the balance. He even added a scoop extra. Thank you, Silas, Maris said coolly. Magnus stepped forward and lifted 2 sacks, one on each shoulder. He didn't grunt. He just looked at Silas. Good day, Magnus said. Silas nodded frantically. Good day, Captain, good day. As they walked back, Maris felt the conflict warring within her. She hated this. She hated that she needed a man's threat to get a fair price. It made her feel small. But she also looked at her purse. She had saved 3 coppers. You're enjoying this, she accused, not looking back. I am carrying 100 pounds of wheat, Magnus said dryly. My joy is boundless. Maris fought a smile. Don't get used to it. Once the winter is over, you're gone. Of course, Magnus said, but his tone was unreadable. The first real test came a week later. It was raining again, a cold, miserable drizzle. Maris was in the kitchen, teaching Lena how to grind spices. Gently, Maris instructed. You want to release the oil, not crush the soul out of it. Lena was holding the pestle too tight. Like this? Looser wrist, Maris said, covering Lena's small hand with her own. Rhythm, like a heartbeat. The door opened without a knock. Comptroller Armand Vell did not knock. He was a man of silk and velvet, out of place in the soot of the low docks, yet he owned half of it. He stepped in, flanked by 2 guards. Maris spun around, placing herself between Vell and Lena. Comptroller, Maris said, her voice like ice. I didn't hear a knock. Vell smiled. It was a wet, oily smile. Widow Crow, my knuckles are too delicate for this peasant wood. I hear you have guests. His eyes drifted to the corner, where Magnus was sitting in the shadows, mending a fishing net. Magnus did not stand up. He went very still. Captain Slate, Vell said, his smile faltering slightly. I heard the rumors. I didn't believe the giant had been tamed by a baker. Not tamed, Magnus said, not looking up from the net. Anchored. Vell cleared his throat. Well, domestic bliss aside, there is the matter of the sanitation tax, new regulation, for households with more than 2 occupants. There is no such tax, Maris said. There is as of this morning, Vell said. He pulled a paper from his sleeve. 10 silvers, or we revoke the kitchen license. 10 silvers was everything Maris had earned that month. It was starvation. Maris felt the panic rising. She opened her mouth to argue, to beg, which was exactly what Vell wanted. Magnus stood up. The sound of the chair scraping against the floor was loud. He unfolded himself to his full height. In the small kitchen, he loomed over Vell like a collapsing cliff. He walked over to the table, picked up the pestle Maris had been using, and set it down with a heavy thud. The widow is carrying my child, Magnus said calmly. That makes this a family dwelling. Families are exempt from the transient tax. Check your own laws, Vell. Section 4, paragraph 2. Vell blinked. He looked at Maris's flat stomach. That remains to be seen. Are you calling me a liar? Magnus asked. He took 1 step forward. The guards behind Vell took a step back. No, Vell said quickly. No, but paperwork must be filed. File it, Magnus said, and get out of my kitchen. You're tracking mud on the floor the girl just scrubbed. Vell's face turned a mottled shade of red. He glared at Maris. This isn't over, Crow. Winter comes fast. Faster for some than others, Magnus said. Vell turned and fled, his guards trailing behind him. Silence returned to the kitchen. Maris leaned against the counter, her knees shaking. Section 4, paragraph 2? She asked breathlessly. I made it up, Magnus admitted. He sat back down and picked up the net. Lena let out a small, terrified giggle. It was the first time Maris had heard her make a sound that wasn't a whimper. Maris looked at Magnus. He was focused on the net, his brow furrowed. He had lied to the law for her. He had threatened a city official. "Thank you," she whispered. Magnus paused. He looked up, his blue eyes capturing hers. "Do not thank me. He will come back, and he will bring harder things than taxes." "I know," Maris said. She looked at Lena, who was smiling at the crushed spices. "But we have tonight." That evening, the dynamic in the house changed. The fear had receded, replaced by a siege mentality. They were a crew now. After supper, a fish stew that Magnus had caught and Maris had seasoned, they sat by the fire. The wind howled outside, impotent against the repaired shutters. Lena pulled the bundle from under her chair. She unwrapped it carefully. It was a book, leather-bound, water-stained, but intact. Maris watched her. "I didn't know you read, Lena." Lena nodded shyly. "My father, he taught me, before." She opened the book. It was a collection of poetry. She began to read aloud, her voice wavering at first, then gaining strength. "The sea does not bargain, it takes what it will. But the land is a miser, waiting mostly to kill." Maris closed her eyes, listening. It had been years since someone read to her. She opened her eyes and looked at Magnus. He was watching Lena with an expression of profound, aching sadness. He wasn't looking at the book. He was looking at the girl's face. "Do you like poetry, Captain?" Maris asked softly. Magnus looked at her. He hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know." "You don't know?" "I cannot read," he said. The admission was stark, devoid of shame, but heavy with reality. "The letters, they're just knots I cannot untie." Maris looked at the book, then at the man who could navigate by the stars, but not by ink. "Lena," Maris said, "read that line again, slower." Lena looked up, surprised, then smiled. She read it again. Maris saw Magnus's hand relax on the arm of his chair. Outside, the winter was coming. The fog was thickening. Armand Vell was plotting. But in the kitchen, with the smell of spices and the sound of a girl's voice, Maris Crow realized that her empty house was suddenly, dangerously full. She looked at Magnus, and for the first time, she didn't see a wall. She saw a man holding up the ceiling so she wouldn't be crushed. "By winter," she whispered to herself, echoing his vow. But in her mind, the threat had turned into something else. Something terrifying. A promise. Winter in Port Caldera did not arrive with snow. It arrived with a damp, bone-aching chill that turned the cobblestones slick and the harbor gray. The fog became a permanent guest, clinging to the eaves of Maris's house like wet wool. Inside, however, the air was different. The kitchen had become a place of rhythmic, coordinated movement. Magnus Slate, the man who could terrify a tavern with a glance, had learned the precise geometry of Maris's workspace. He knew exactly where to stand to avoid the swing of the oven door. He knew that when Maris tapped the wooden spoon twice on the counter, she needed the heavy sack of root vegetables from the cellar. They moved around each other in a dance of necessity that was slowly, dangerously, becoming something else. "Lift," Maris said, not looking up from the simmering pot of fish stock. Magnus, seated on a stool peeling potatoes, with a knife that looked like a toothpick in his hand, stood up. He crossed the room in 2 strides, gripped the heavy iron cauldron, and shifted it to the cooler hook of the hearth. He didn't spill a drop. "Higher," Maris corrected. He adjusted it. His forearm brushed against her shoulder. The contact was brief, a mere graze of linen against cotton, but Maris felt it like a burn. She stiffened, just for a second, before aggressively stirring the broth. "Too much salt in the air today," she muttered, blaming the flush on her cheeks on the weather. "The tide is high," Magnus replied, his voice a low rumble near her ear. He didn't move away immediately. He stayed there, a massive, warm presence at her back, shielding her from the draft of the window. "Storm coming." Maris turned, meaning to tell him to go back to the potatoes, but she found herself looking at his chest. She tilted her head up. His eyes were dark, watchful. The weeks of living under the same roof had stripped away some of the legend and left the man. He smelled of wood smoke and the lemon soap she made him use. "We need more wood," she said, her voice tighter than she intended. I chopped a cord this morning, Magnus said. It's stacked by the door. Oh, and I fixed the leak in the pantry. I see. And I frightened the tax collector away from the widow down the lane, just by standing on the porch and sharpening my axe. Maris fought a smile. You're very pleased with yourself, Captain. I am earning my keep, he said, as per the rules. The rules, Maris repeated. The word felt flimsy now. Lena was sitting at the small table in the corner, a quill scratching against parchment. She had become the quiet heartbeat of the house. While Magnus was the walls and Maris was the fire, Lena was the window, fragile, letting in light, but easily broken. Done, Lena announced softly. She blew on the ink. Maris moved away from Magnus, grateful for the distraction. She went to the table. Let me see. Lena had turned the week's ledger into a recipe for winter stew. 3 pounds of carrots meant 3 silvers earned. 2 cups of sour wine meant 2 coppers spent on oil. It was brilliant, and it was necessary. If Vel's men ever raided the house, they would find a cookbook, not a record of the widow's slowly recovering profits. Your handwriting is improving, Maris said, running a finger over the loops. But why is there a star next to the sugar? Lena blushed, ducking her head. It reminds me of a story, about a star that fell into a sugar bowl. Maris frowned slightly. A story? From the book? No, Lena said quickly. Just a story I heard. Maris felt a prickle of unease. Heard where? At the market, Lena said, her voice going high and thin. When I went for the eggs. Maris studied the girl's face. Lena was a terrible liar. Her hands were twisting in her lap. But before Maris could press her, a heavy pounding on the front door shattered the quiet. It wasn't the police knock. It was the rhythmic, self-important rap of a messenger. Magnus was at the door before the echo faded. He didn't open it fully, just enough to loom. A young boy, dripping wet and looking terrified, held up a scroll sealed with red wax. For the Widow Crow, from the comptroller. Magnus took the scroll. The boy ran as if a kraken had just surfaced. Magnus shut the door and handed the scroll to Maris. The wax seal bore the crest of Port Caldera, a ship and a scale. Maris broke the seal. Her eyes scanned the elegant looping script. An eviction notice? Magnus asked, his hand already drifting to his belt. Worse, Maris said, crunkling the paper. An invitation. She tossed it onto the table. The annual charity supper at the Chapel of St. Elmo. Vel is hosting it for the benefit of the orphans and widows of the fleet. Irony is not dead, Magnus muttered. He demands that I cook, Maris said, pacing the small kitchen. He says my fish stew is legendary, and it would be a sin against the community if I didn't provide the main course. Refuse, Magnus said. If I refuse, I am uncharitable, I am ungrateful, I am an enemy of the church and the poor, Maris said bitterly. And if I go, I am serving the man who is trying to ruin me in front of the entire town. He wants to humiliate you, Magnus said. He wants to see you serving him. Yes, Maris stopped pacing. She looked at the crumpled paper, then at her flour-stained hands. He wants a servant. He thinks he can break me with a ladle, said Maris. She looked up at Magnus. Her eyes were hard, the color of flint. I'm going to cook him the best meal he's ever eaten, she declared. I'm going to make him weep over a bowl of soup, and you are coming with me. Magnus raised an eyebrow. Me? I am not known for my dinner conversation. You are coming as my husband-to-be, Maris said, the lie tasting like copper in her mouth. You are coming to stand there and look like you own the room, so they don't think they own me. The day of the supper was a blur of steam and steel. The chapel courtyard had been covered with canvas tents to keep out the rain, and long tables were set up near the braziers. But the cooking happened in the chapel's massive stone kitchen. It was a battlefield. Maris commanded it. Magnus, the onions, she shouted over the roar of the fire. The giant pirate was standing at a chopping block, weeping. The pile of onions before him was massive. This is Torture, he grumbled, wiping his eyes with his forearm. I have sailed through hurricanes. I have fought men with knives. This vegetable is the devil. Chop smaller, Maris ordered, hiding a smile. She moved past him, tasting the broth. It needed more acid. Lena, the lemons. Lena scurried over with a basket of lemons. She was pale, terrified of the bustling servants and the priests drifting in and out. But she stayed close to Maris's skirts. The kitchen was filled with other cooks, women from the market, servants of the wealthy merchants. They watched Maris and Magnus with open fascination. Look at him, they whispered, doing the widow's bidding. He looks ready to kill that onion. She has him wrapped around her finger. Maris heard them. She kept her head high. Let them talk. Talk was better than silence. As the evening wore on, the tension shifted. The food was ready. The guests were arriving. Maris wiped her face with a damp cloth. She wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that she had mended 3 times. She tied a clean white apron over it. You look, Magnus started, then stopped. He was standing by the door, washing the onion juice from his hands. He had put his coat back on. He looked like a storm cloud poured into a suit. I look like a cook, Maris said, checking her hair in the reflection of a copper pan. You look like a queen going to an execution, Magnus said softly. He stepped closer. He reached out and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers were rough, calloused, but his touch was incredibly light. Maris stopped breathing. The kitchen noise faded. For a moment, there was only the heat of his hand and the look in his eyes, a look that was not part of the deal. It was raw, hungry, and terrified. Maris, he whispered. Widow Crow. A voice boomed. They sprang apart. Armand Vell stood in the doorway, resplendent in crimson velvet. The guests are seated, Vell said, his eyes flicking between them with amusement. We are waiting for the masterpiece. Maris smoothed her apron. She grabbed the handle of the soup tureen. Magnus picked up the massive cauldron as if it were a teacup. Lead the way. The dining hall was packed. Candles flickered in the draft. The elite of Port Caldera, merchants, captains, church officials sat at the long tables. When Maris and Magnus entered, the conversation died. Maris walked to the head table where Vell sat. She gestured for Magnus to set the cauldron down. Fish stew, she announced, her voice clear. Made with rockfish from our own harbor, saffron from the trade ships, and peppers from the market. A dish that binds us all. Vell clapped slowly. Charming, simply charming. He stood up holding a wine goblet. A toast to the Widow Crow, who proves that even in difficult circumstances, one can still serve one's betters. The insult was subtle, wrapped in silk. And to Captain Slate, Vell continued, turning his gaze on Magnus, who has traded his cutlass for a kitchen knife, a domestication we all sleep safer for. Laughter rippled through the room. It was nervous laughter, but it stung. Magnus didn't move. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at a point above Vell's head. And, Vell added, his eyes dropping to Maris's waist, to the future generation. Though I must say, widow, for a woman 3 months along, you are remarkably trim. Perhaps the giant seed is smaller than his reputation? The silence that followed was absolute. Maris felt the blood drain from her face. This was it, the public shaming. She saw Magnus's hands clench into fists behind his back. The knuckles turned white. The veins in his neck stood out. He was going to kill him. He was going to snap Vell's neck, and then they would all hang. Maris stepped forward. She picked up the ladle and slammed it into the tureen, the sound cracking like a pistol shot. The stew is hot, comptroller, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. And like a good child, it takes time to grow rich, unlike your manners, which seem to have withered on the vine. She ladled a bowl of stew and shoved it toward him. Eat, before it gets cold. We wouldn't want to waste the charity. A few of the market women at the back of the room snickered. Then the priest chuckled. The tension broke. Vel's face tightened, but he sat down. He had been outmaneuvered by a bowl of soup and a sharp tongue. "Delicious," he muttered, taking a spoon. The walk home was silent. The rain had turned into a downpour. They walked quickly, Lena huddled under Magnus's coat, which he held over her like a tent. Maris walked beside them, the adrenaline fading, leaving her shaking. When they got inside the house, Magnus slammed the door and threw the bolt. He paced the kitchen, water dripping from his hair. "I should have killed him," he growled. "I should have cut his tongue out." "And then what?" Maris asked, leaning against the table. "Then we are dead or on the run." "He insulted you. He insulted the child." Magnus stopped. The vow. "He is a small man with a lot of power," Maris said. "Small men use words because they are afraid of steel. You won, Magnus. You stood there and you didn't break." Magnus stopped pacing. He looked at her. "I didn't do it for the vow. I did it because if I moved, I would have destroyed everything you built." He crossed the room and stood in front of her. The kitchen was dark, lit only by the dying embers of the hearth. "You were brave," he said. "I was terrified," Maris admitted. "You didn't look it." He reached out, hesitating, then placed his hands on her shoulders. His grip was heavy, grounding. "You defended me. You're my sous chef," Maris whispered, a weak attempt at a joke. Magnus didn't smile. He looked down at her mouth. The air in the kitchen grew heavy, charged with the electricity of the storm and the months of proximity. He leaned down. Maris tilted her head back. She didn't pull away. She wanted this. She wanted to forget the taxes and the lies and the cold. His lips were an inch from hers. She could feel his breath. "Maris," he breathed. A sound from the corner broke the spell. Lena dropped a book. Magnus froze. He pulled back, his eyes clearing. He looked at Lena, who was scrambling to pick up the volume, her face red. I'm sorry," Lena stammered. "I slipped." Magnus stepped away from Maris, turning his back. "It's late, we should sleep." Maris touched her lips, feeling the ghost of the kiss. "Yes, sleep." 2 days later, the rain stopped, leaving the streets washed clean and the gutters overflowing. Maris was sweeping the front step. The encounter with Vel had bought them time. The town was talking about her wit, not her license. But the pressure remained. As she swept the wet leaves from the cobblestones, her broom caught on something stuck in the mud near the drainpipe. She bent down to pick it up. It was a paper boat. It was soggy and ruined, but the shape was distinct. It was folded with precision. Maris turned it over in her hands. The paper was not the rough scrap Lena used for her fire starters. It was thick, creamy vellum, high quality, and on the side, faint but visible in blue ink, was a symbol, a stylized eye inside a triangle. Maris felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. She knew that symbol. She had seen it on the crates at the customs house. It was the mark of the archivists, the clerks who managed the port authority's records. Vel's inner circle, Lena. Maris crushed the boat in her hand. She walked back inside, her heart hammering. Lena was by the fire, sewing a button on Magnus's shirt. She looked up and smiled. "Is it clearing up?" Maris closed the door. She walked over to the fire and held out her hand, opening her fist to reveal the crushed boat. "Where did you get the paper, Lena?" Maris asked, her voice very quiet. Lena's smile vanished. She went pale. I found it." "Don't lie to me," Maris said. "This is vellum. It costs more than our weekly food budget. Who gave it to you?" Lena's lip trembled. He's nice. He likes poetry." "Who?" "Thomas," Lena whispered. "He works at the lower docks. He just talks to me. He says I remind him of his sister." "Thomas," Maris repeated. "Does Thomas ask you questions?" Lena looked down. "Sometimes. He asks if the captain is happy, if you are truly expecting." Maris closed her eyes. And what do you tell him? I tell him the truth, Lena cried, tears spilling over. That you are happy, that the captain is good. And the baby? Maris asked sharply. Lena hesitated. I tell him what you said, that it's a winter baby. Maris sank into a chair. It wasn't malice. It was innocence. Lena was lonely, and a friendly face with a piece of paper had unlocked the door. But innocence in Port Caldera was just as dangerous as malice. Lena, Maris said, grabbing the girl's hands, Thomas is not your friend. He is a spy. Every word you say to him goes straight to Vel. Lena gasped. No, he wouldn't. He would. Maris said grimly, and now they know. They suspect the lie. That afternoon, Maris told Magnus she needed herbs for a headache. She wrapped her shawl tight and walked not to the apothecary, but to the edge of the slums, to a crooked house with dried bundles of sage hanging in the window. Isabel Soria opened the door before Maris knocked. The midwife was a woman of indeterminate age, with eyes that had seen every way a life could enter or leave the world. Widow Crow, Isabel said, stepping aside, you don't look pregnant. You look hunted. Maris stepped into the herb-scented gloom. I need advice. Isabel, not tea. Isabel gestured to a chair. Advice is expensive. Tea is cheap. I am living a lie, Maris said, sitting down, and the lie is starting to rot. Isabel poured 2 cups of dark, bitter liquid. The giant's vow. Yes, the whole port is holding its breath for the christening. There is no baby, Maris said bluntly. I know, Isabel said calmly. I saw you at the market last week. You carry a sack of flour like a woman with a strong back, not a woman guarding a womb, and your hips haven't shifted. If you know, others know, Maris said, panic rising. Men don't know, Isabel said with a dry chuckle. Men see what they fear or what they want. Magnus is big and scary, so they believe his seed is potent. It fits their story. But for how long? Until winter, Isabel said, which is almost here. She leaned forward, her face serious. But that is not your problem, Maris. Your problem is that you are starting to like the cage because the lion is warm. Maris flinched. He is protecting me. He is claiming you, Isabel corrected. There is a difference. A man who vows to own you to save you, he still thinks he owns you. What happens when the danger passes? Does he give you back? Maris stared into her tea. I don't know. Magnus is a good man, for a pirate, Isabel said, but he is a man used to command. If you want to survive this winter, you need to stop being his cargo and start being his captain. You need leverage that isn't his reputation. How? Find out what he is afraid of, Isabel said. Everyone is afraid of something, even giants. Find his fear and you hold the leash. Maris walked home in the twilight. The fog was back. Find his fear. She thought of the book Magnus couldn't read. She thought of the way he looked at Lena with guilt. She thought of the way he stood between her and Vel. His fear wasn't dying. His fear was failing to protect. And Maris realized with a jolt that she wasn't just fighting for her house anymore. She was fighting for the right to choose him, rather than just needing him. She turned the corner to her street. The house was dark, save for the candle in the window. It looked like home, and that was the most dangerous trap of all. Maris entered the house with the chill of Isabel's warnings still clinging to her skin. The kitchen was warm, but the silence was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the scratch of Lena's quill. Magnus was at the table, polishing the brass fittings of a lantern. He looked up as she entered, his expression shifting from focus to a guarded relief. You were gone a long time, he said. I had a lot to discuss, Maris replied, unwrapping her shawl. She didn't look at him. She looked at Lena. Lena, go upstairs, take the book. Lena froze, her quill hovering over the paper. She looked between them, sensing the sudden drop in barometric pressure in the room. Go. Magnus said gently. Lena scrambled up, grabbed her book, and disappeared up the loft stairs. The door clicked shut. Maris turned to Magnus. He had set down the rag and the lantern. He was watching her, his body still, like a predator waiting for the wind to change. "You know about Thomas," he said. It wasn't a question. "I found the boat," Maris said, "and I know he is asking questions about the baby that doesn't exist." "I will handle Thomas," Magnus said, his voice darkening. "He won't approach her again." "No," Maris said sharply. "You won't handle him with fists, because Thomas isn't the problem. He's just a symptom." She walked to the table and placed her hands flat on the wood, leaning in. "Isabel told me to find your fear. I think I found it. You aren't afraid of Vel. You aren't afraid of the law. You're afraid of the past." Magnus looked away, staring into the fire. "Every sailor fears the past, Maris. It's the wake behind the ship." "Don't give me sea metaphors," she snapped. "I want the truth. You told me you owed a debt to Lena's father. You said you came here to protect her. But Vel isn't chasing a teenage girl for sport, and he isn't chasing you just because you're a pirate." She took a breath. "Who sent you here, Magnus? Who told you that my house was the place to hide?" Magnus was silent for a long time. The fire popped, a log settling into the ash. Finally, he looked back at her. The exhaustion in his eyes was profound. "It wasn't a who," he said quietly. "It was a map." "A map?" "Captain Thorne," Magnus began, the name heavy in his mouth. "Lena's father. He was a great man, but he was a hoarder of secrets. He kept a ledger. The Black Ledger. It contains the routes of every smuggler, the location of every safe harbor, the name of every corrupt official in the Caribbean." Maris felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Including Armand Vel?" "Especially Armand Vel," Magnus said. "Vel isn't just a comptroller. He's the gatekeeper for the syndicate. He takes a cut of everything that moves through these waters." Thorne had the proof. "And when Thorne died," Maris whispered, "he made me swear," Magnus said, "to protect Lena, and to keep the ledger out of Vel's hands. If Vel gets it, he controls the entire coast. If he doesn't, he will burn down the world to find it." "So you have it," Maris said. "The ledger." Magnus nodded slowly. "It is hidden, safe. And you came here?" "Because your husband," Magnus said, looking her in the eye, "was the only man Thorne trusted on land. He built the hiding place." Maris recoiled, as if he had slapped her. "My husband? Elias?" "Elias Crow was a carpenter," Magnus said, "but he built false bottoms for ships. He built the safe in Thorne's cabin, and he built one here, before he died." Maris stared at the walls of her kitchen, her home, the place she thought was her sanctuary. It wasn't just a house, it was a vault. And she had been living on top of a bomb. "You knew," she whispered. "You knew Elias, and you never told me." "I knew his work," Magnus said. "I never met him, but Thorne told me, if the storm comes, go to the Widow Crow. She is the keeper of the key, even if she doesn't know it." "I don't have a key," Maris cried. "I don't know anything about this." "You are the key, Maris," Magnus said, his voice pleading now. "Your safety, your house, the ledger is here, somewhere. I haven't found it yet. That's why I've been fixing the floorboards. That's why I've been checking the roof." Maris felt the room spin. The kindness, the repairs, the labor, it wasn't just payment for rent. It was a search. "You used me," she said, her voice trembling. "The vow, by winter, it wasn't to protect me. It was to buy you time to tear my house apart, looking for a book." "No," Magnus stood up, reaching for her. "Maris, listen. Don't touch me," she shouted, backing away. "You made me a shield. You painted a target on my back and called it protection. By winter, that's the deadline, isn't it? That's when Vel loses patience?" "That's when the syndicate arrives," Magnus admitted, his hands dropping to his sides. "They gave Vel until the winter solstice to produce the ledger. If he doesn't, they will remove him. He is desperate. That is why he is squeezing us." "Us?" Maris laughed, a harsh, brittle sound. "There is no us, Captain. There is you, the treasure hunter. And there is me, the distraction. That is not true, Magnus said. The rumble in his voice was gone, replaced by a raw desperation. It started that way, yes, I admit it. I came here for the book. I spoke the vow to keep Vel at bay while I searched. But he took a step forward, ignoring her flinch. But then I saw you, he said. I saw you fighting the world with a sack of flour and a sharp tongue. I saw you teaching Lena to read. I saw you standing in that chapel, defying a man who could hang us both. He stopped, his chest heaving. I stopped looking for the ledger weeks ago, Maris. I have been fixing the roof because I wanted you to be dry. I have been hauling wood because I wanted you to be warm. Then why didn't you tell me? Maris asked, tears stinging her eyes. Because I was afraid, Magnus whispered. I was afraid that if you knew the danger, you would run. And I could not bear to see you leave. Maris looked at him. The giant, the legend, looked small in the dim light. He was a man trapped by an oath to a dead friend and a lie to a living woman. But Isabel's voice echoed in her head. Protection often turns into possession. You didn't trust me, Maris said, her voice steadying. You decided for me. You decided my life was worth risking for your secret. You made me a piece on your board. She walked to the door and opened it. The cold night air rushed in. Get out, she said. Magnus looked at her, stunned. Maris, get out of my kitchen, she said. Go sleep in the shed. Go sleep on the ship. I don't care. But do not sleep under my roof tonight. Magnus stood there for a moment, searching her face for any sign of wavering. He found none. He nodded once. He grabbed his coat and walked out into the dark. Maris slammed the door and locked it. Then she slid down to the floor and wept. The next 2 days were a cold war. Magnus slept in the woodshed at the back of the garden. He didn't come into the kitchen. He left wood by the door. He brought fresh fish and left them in a bucket. Lena was a ghost, moving silently between the house and the shed, carrying messages that were never spoken. She looked terrified, as if her world was fracturing down the middle. Maris threw herself into her work. She baked until the air was thick with flour. She scrubbed the floors until her hands were raw. She was trying to scrub away the feeling of betrayal, but it was stained deep. On the third morning, the blow landed. A notice was pinned to her door. Public hearing regarding the moral and sanitary state of the residents of Widow Crow. To be held at the Winter Solstice Festival. Failure to appear will result in immediate confiscation of property and wardship of the minor, Lena Thorne. It was signed by Armin Vel. The winter solstice was tomorrow. Maris stared at the paper. It wasn't an inspection. It was a trial. He was going to take Lena. He was going to take the house. He was going to tear the walls down to find the ledger himself. She grabbed the paper and marched to the woodshed. Magnus was sharpening his cutlass. He looked up as she stormed in. He looked terrible, unshaven, dark circles under his eyes. He's made his move, Maris said, throwing the paper at him. Magnus read it. His face hardened into stone. He knows I haven't found it. He's coming for the house. He's coming for Lena, Maris said. Wardship. He'll put her in an orphanage or worse until she talks. Magnus stood up. He sheathed the cutlass. I will go to him. I will surrender myself. I'll tell him I burned the ledger. He won't believe you, Maris said, and he'll kill you, and then he'll come for us anyway. Then we fight, Magnus said. I can take his guards. We can get to the ship. No, Maris shouted. No more running. No more hiding behind vows or swords. She stepped close to him, invading his space. You want to protect us? Then you do it my way. What is your way? Magnus asked. We stop lying, Maris said. The vow, by winter, it ends tomorrow. We go to that hearing and we tell the truth. That there is no baby? Magnus asked. That I am a fraud? They will laugh at us. Then they will hang us. Not if we change the terms, Maris said. Her mind was racing, connecting the dots that Magnus had missed. Vel operates in the shadows. He uses rumors and morality because he can't admit he's looking for a smuggler's book. If he admits the ledger exists, the syndicate will kill him for losing it. Magnus's eyes widened. He has to keep it a secret. Exactly, Maris said. He's trapping us with public shame, so we trap him with public truth. But to do that, I need to be free of you. Free of me? Magnus looked stricken. I need to be free of your ownership, Maris said firmly. I will not stand there as your pregnant whore. I will stand there as Maris Crow, the owner of this house. And you will stand there as... She hesitated. As what? Magnus asked hoarsely. As the man who loves me. Maris said, not the man who owns me. Can you do that? Can you stand beside me without shielding me? Magnus looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the strength he had underestimated from the moment he knocked on her door. I have never loved anything else, he said, the confession tearing out of him. Good, Maris said. She didn't smile. This wasn't a romance. It was a battle plan. Then tonight, we find the ledger. I told you I've looked everywhere, Magnus said. The floorboards, the roof. You looked like a pirate, Maris said. You looked for a box, a safe. She turned and looked back at the house. Elias wasn't a pirate. He was a baker's husband. He didn't hide things in the dark. He hid them in the light. She marched back to the house, Magnus trailing her. She went straight to the kitchen. She looked at the heavy oak table. She looked at the hearth. Then she looked at the one thing that had been in the house as long as she had, the rolling pin. It was massive, carved from a single piece of ironwood. It hung on hooks above the stove. Hand me that, Maris said. Magnus reached up and took it down. It's just a rolling pin, Maris. It's solid wood. Is it? Maris asked. Elias made it for me our first winter. He said, this will help you make bread that rises, no matter how heavy the dough. She took it from him. It was heavy. She inspected the ends. One end had a small decorative inlay of mother of pearl, a star. Lena, Maris called out, bring me your book. Lena came running down from the loft. The story, Maris said. The one about the star in the sugar bowl? Lena blinked. The star falls, and the sugar turns to snow. Maris looked at the rolling pin. She twisted the handle with the star. It didn't move. Sugar, she muttered. She walked to the pantry. She plunged the end of the rolling pin into the sack of sugar. Nothing happened. Maris, Magnus said gently, it's just wood. No, Maris said. He built false bottoms. He built tricks. She looked at the rolling pin again. The sugar turns to snow. Snow. Cold. She walked to the window, opened it, and thrust the rolling pin out into the freezing winter air. She let it sit there on the sill for a minute. The ironwood contracted in the cold. She twisted the handle again. Click. The end cap unscrewed. Magnus gasped. Maris tilted the rolling pin. A tight roll of thin oilskin paper slid out into her hand. She unrolled it on the table. It was covered in tiny, dense handwriting. Charts, names, routes, and right at the top, paid to A. Vel, 500 gold. The ledger, Magnus breathed. He looked at Maris with awe. It was in your hand every day. Elias knew I would never leave the kitchen, Maris said, a sad smile touching her lips. He knew I would always be baking. She looked at Magnus. We have the weapon. Now we need the stage. The hearing, Magnus said. Tomorrow, Maris said. We go to the hearing, and we don't bring a baby. We bring a book. And the vow? Magnus asked. By winter. Maris looked at him. The anger had faded, replaced by a steely resolve. The vow is broken, she said. The lie is over. She reached out and took his hand. His palm was rough, warm, and trembling slightly. Tomorrow, Magnus, you don't promise them a son, she said. You promise them the truth. And if we survive, then we can talk about what we promise each other. Magnus squeezed her hand. I will follow your lead, Captain. Maris nodded. Get some sleep. We have a government to overthrow in the morning. The morning of the winter solstice dawned cold and bright, the sky a hard, polished blue that offered no sympathy. Port Caldera was already awake. Drums beat in the distance, marking the festival, but the real attraction was at the chapel of St. Elmo. Maris dressed in her best charcoal wool. She braided her hair tight, weaving a ribbon of deep red through the dark strands, a color of war, not mourning. Downstairs, Magnus was waiting. He had shaved. He wore a clean white shirt under his heavy coat, but he had left his cutlass behind. It was the most terrifying he had ever looked. A warrior who didn't need a weapon to be dangerous. Lena stood beside him, clutching her book, pale but steady. "Are you ready?" Maris asked. Magnus looked at her. "I am terrified," he admitted. "I would rather face a cannonade." "Good," Maris said. She picked up her baking basket, covered with a checkered cloth. "Fear keeps you sharp." They walked out into the street. The fog had lifted, leaving the air crisp. As they moved toward the chapel, the crowd gathered. It wasn't the respectful silence of the autumn. It was the buzzing, hungry noise of a mob expecting a spectacle. "There she is. Look at her belly, flat as a board. Vel is going to skin them alive." Maris walked with her head high. She didn't hold Magnus's arm. She walked beside him, matching his long strides. The courtyard was packed. A raised platform had been built in front of the heavy wooden doors of the chapel. Armand Vel sat there on a high-backed chair, flanked by 4 guards and a scribe. He looked like a king on a throne of borrowed power. "Widow Crow," Vel boomed as they approached. "Captain Slate, you are prompt. I admire that in the condemned." The crowd quieted. Maris stepped up to the base of the platform. Magnus stood just behind her right shoulder, Lena behind her left, a triangle of defiance. "We are here for the hearing, Comptroller," Maris said, her voice projecting clearly over the cobblestones. "You summoned us." "I summoned a family," Vel sneered, leaning forward. "But I see only a spinster, a criminal, and a waif. Where is the child, Captain? The winter has come. The vow is due." He gestured to the crowd. "This man promised a son, a legacy, and yet look at her, barren as a salted field." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Magnus didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on Vel. "The terms of the residence," Vel continued, pulling a document from his sleeve, "require a familial bond. Since there's no child, the license is void. The property is forfeit to the port authority." He pointed a gloved finger at Lena. "And the girl? She is clearly neglected. She will be taken into the custody of the state for her own protection." 2 guards stepped forward. Lena let out a small whimper. "Stop," Maris said. It wasn't a shout. It was a command. "There is no child," Maris announced. The crowd gasped. The admission was fatal. In Port Caldera, admitting a lie was admitting defeat. "He lied," someone shouted. "The giant is a fraud," Vel smiled, a predatory, satisfied grin. "You admit it. The vow was false." "The vow was a shield," Maris said, her voice rising, "because in this town, a woman cannot be safe unless she belongs to a man. And a man cannot be safe unless he is feared." She stepped up onto the first step of the platform, putting herself eye level with Vel's boots. "But we are done with shields," she said. "You asked for a harvest, Comptroller. You asked what we have been growing in my house all winter." She reached into her basket. She didn't pull out bread. She pulled out the scroll. Vel's smile vanished. He recognized the oilskin paper. He recognized the seal of Captain Thorne. "Seize her!" Vel shrieked, standing up. "She has a weapon. I have a ledger," Maris shouted, holding the scroll high. She turned to the crowd. "I have the names. I have the dates. I have the price of every barrel of rum, every stolen crate of silk, and every bribe paid to the Comptroller's office." The guards hesitated. The crowd surged forward. "Bribes? The Comptroller?" "Lies!" Vel screamed. "Shoot her!" Magnus moved. He didn't attack. He simply stepped in front of Maris, his massive back becoming a wall between her and the guards. He folded his arms. "Read it, Maris," Magnus roared. Maris unfurled the scroll. September 4th. The Saint Marie. Cargo. Opium. Bribe paid to Armand Vell, 300 gold. The crowd roared. The merchant whose ship had been seized on September 4th shouted, "That was my ship. He told me it was lost at sea." October 12th, Maris continued, reading faster. The Black Gull. Human cargo. Safe passage granted by Comptroller Vell. Price, 500 gold. The mood in the courtyard shifted instantly. It went from a trial to a riot. The people of Port Caldera tolerated pirates. They tolerated thieves. They did not tolerate men who sold their own neighbors. Vell looked at the crowd. He saw the anger. He saw the end of his reign. He saw the syndicate's shadow reaching for him. "Get them!" he screamed at his guards. But the guards were locals. They looked at the scroll. They looked at the angry mob. They lowered their pikes. Vell scrambled backward, tripping over his chair. "This is treason. I am the wall." "You are a clerk with a dirty book," Magnus said, his voice cutting through the noise. Father Thomas, the old priest of St. Elmo, stepped forward from the crowd. He reached up and took the scroll from Maris. "I will take this into the sanctuary," the priest said sternly, "and I will read every name in the light of God." Vell turned and ran. He scrambled off the back of the platform, disappearing into the alleyway, his velvet coat flapping like the wings of a dying bird. He wouldn't get far. The syndicate didn't forgive exposure. The crowd cheered. It was a deafening, chaotic sound of victory. Maris stood on the step, shaking. She felt a hand on her shoulder. She turned. Magnus was looking at her. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her as if she were the only thing in the world. "You didn't need me," he said, a strange mix of pride and sadness in his voice. "You saved yourself." "I didn't do it alone," Maris said. She reached out and pulled Lena up to stand with them. The three of them stood there as the winter sun climbed higher, warming the stones. The lie was gone. The threat was gone. The aftermath was quiet. By evening, the news had spread. Vell was gone, fled on a sloop, some said. Taken by men in dark coats, said others. The kitchen license was reinstated by the priest himself. Maris, Magnus, and Lena sat in the kitchen. The scroll was gone, safe in the church vault. The rolling pin was back on its hooks. It was over. Magnus stood up. He picked up his coat from the chair. "Where are you going?" Maris asked. She was kneading dough for the morning bread, the rhythm familiar and grounding. "The winter is here," Magnus said. "The vow is fulfilled. You are safe. Lena is safe. My debt to Thorn is paid." He looked at the door. "I should go. A widow's reputation can only stretch so far." Lena looked up from her book. "But the roof still leaks in the corner." Magnus smiled sadly at the girl. "I fixed it yesterday, Lena." The wood needs chopping?" Lena tried again. "Enough for a month is stacked outside." Magnus looked at Maris. He was waiting. He was giving her the choice he had stolen from her months ago. He was leaving the door open. Maris wiped her hands on her apron. She walked around the table. She stood in front of him, looking up at the scar on his jaw, the blue of his eyes. "You promised them a son," she said softly. Magnus flinched. "Maris, You promised them a future," she corrected. "You promised that by winter, this house would have life in it." She reached out and took the coat from his hands. She hung it back on the peg. "The winter is just starting, Magnus," she said, "and I cannot run this kitchen alone. I need a man who can reach the high shelves." Magnus stared at her. "You want me to stay? As a worker?" "No," Maris said. She stepped closer, until her chest brushed against his. "I want you to stay as a partner. No more vows, no more debts, just us." "And the town?" Magnus whispered. "They will talk." "Let them talk," Maris said. "Let them say the widow tamed the giant, or let them say the giant saved the widow. I don't care." She'd take his face in her hands. His skin was rough, warm. "I only care about the truth," she said. Magnus let out a breath that sounded like a breaking wave. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her into the fortress of his body. He buried his face in her hair. "I am yours, Maris," he murmured, without a vow, without an end. Lena watched them from the corner, a small smile on her face. She dipped her quill into the ink and opened the ledger cookbook to a fresh page. She wrote, "First day of winter. Ingredients: flour, salt, hope." Maris pulled back slightly and kissed him. It wasn't a desperate kiss in the rain. It was a slow, deliberate kiss by the fire, a promise kept. Outside, the wind howled, but the house did not shake. It was anchored deep. The end.